Chapter 1. The Package. With a sudden jolt to his body, he opened his eyes. His heart was racing, his shirt was drenched, and he couldn't see anything. He could feel his body trembling, while drops of sweat ran down his arms and torso. For a brief instant, his body felt paralyzed. He took a moment to calm himself down, to figure out where he was. A few minutes later, he gradually began to regain the ability to move his limbs. As he removed the sheets off his damp body, he got out of the bed and staggered towards the light switch. He could finally see his surroundings. It was all familiar to him. Not so much the bedroom, but the experience itself. As he walked to the bathroom, still half asleep, he looked into the mirror. Now I won't be able to go back to sleep, he thought to himself. He hadn't been able to sleep through the night for as long as he could remember. Walking back to his bedroom, he was clearly wide awake. He grabbed his phone from underneath the pillow and checked the time. It was 2:37 a.m. He took a deep breath, held it in for a few seconds, and exhaled. He sat on his bed with his hands on his head in frustration. Trying to figure out what to do next, he decided to go over to his desk. He took out his notepad and started to write. When he glanced at the clock, he realized the time. It was morning. The birds were chirping, and the sun had started to pierce through the blinds. He'd been writing all night. Wow, that was quick. Writing always centered him. It gave him a sense of calm, a sense of peace. Putting his notepad away, he started to get ready for the day.
Tristan.
His uncle called for him from the kitchen. He preferred to go by TJ, but his uncle's formality was never to be questioned.
Coming, sir.
He called back.
You don't want to be late, so you better get going.
Yes, sir, I'm almost ready.
Today was actually a big day. TJ had received multiple early offers from colleges around the country, full-ride scholarships, guaranteed. TJ had just come off the best season of his high school football career, achieving his best numbers as a junior. He led his team to the national championship, was an All-American, and the recipient of multiple Best Player of the Year awards. He was one of the most sought-after quarterbacks in the country. The reason today was particularly significant was because he had appointments with USC and UCLA. Being a native to Southern California, a local college was a logical choice, and it didn't hurt that these two colleges were two of the best colleges one could attend, at least in California. Yet with all that he had going for him, all the opportunities that awaited him, opportunities that 99% of his peers would kill for, TJ was undecided, and not just about which college to commit to. He couldn't stop thinking about his future. Everyone expected him to go to college through a football scholarship and maybe go pro if everything went according to plan. For his uncle and everyone else in his life, it was automatic.
Make sure you have gas in the car.
Yes, sir.
You got everything you need.
Yes, sir. I'm good to go.
Okay, I'll see you later then. Good luck.
Thank you.
TJ responded. He got his backpack from his room, along with his car keys, phone, and wallet. As he opened the front door of the house, he saw a brown box on the porch. It had no information on it, except his name on top, written in black marker. Getting mail wasn't anything unusual for TJ. The stacks of letters on the unused dinner table were proof of that. What was a bit strange was the informality of the package. No college logo, or logo of any kind, no return address, no stamp, not even TJ's home address, which would be required to mail any package. It did have his name on it, so he knew the package was at the very least intended for him. With curiosity getting the better of him, TJ dropped all his stuff, picked up the box, and took it to his room. Before he could pass the doorway, he heard his uncle calling out to him from the living room.
Tristan.
Not wanting his uncle to see the box, he stuck his head around the wall, just enough for him to see his uncle's face.
Yes, sir.
He responded.
Why are you still here? You're going to be late. You can't start off by giving a bad impression to either of these schools, regardless of which one you choose. Just because you got options don't mean you can do as you please. You still got to follow the rules.
Yes, sir, I just forgot something in my room.
He turned around quickly into his room before his uncle continued with the lecture. For a moment he had forgotten about the intrigue of the package. He put the box down on his bed, grabbed a pair of scissors, and sliced through the middle from one end to the other. He paused. What if it's not something pleasant? But between the curiosity that consumed him and the uncle in the living room who was about to call out his name again, TJ decided to open the package. At first, all TJ could see and feel was a whole lot of white package cushioning. Eventually getting to the center, it was another box. This time a smaller box, about the width of his size 13 sneakers. Unlike the brown box, this box looked better. It looked fancy. Not only in its appearance, but in its texture too. It felt strange, very smooth, yet with a subtle bit of coarseness to it. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. It wasn't made of cardboard, it had a marbly texture to it. And yet, it looked like a small cardboard box. After a little hesitation, TJ opened the peculiar-looking box. Inside were a watch, a credit card, and a passport. Curiouser and curiouser, he thought to himself. I am so surprised that for this moment I quite forgot how to speak good English. He snickered to himself in amusement, as he wondered why that line came to his mind as it did. The credit card had his name embossed on it, and likewise with the passport. It had a current photo of him, with all his details. What is going on here, he said aloud. None of it was making sense to him. As he removed everything from the box, to ensure he wasn't missing anything, he noticed there was a note inside. It read, "Destiny awaits if you choose to accept. Hyatt Regency Kathmandu, Nepal. May 30th, 6 p.m.
This is crazy.
TJ exclaimed. The absurdity of the situation overshadowed the cheesiness of the quote. Just as he was about to sit down to take it all in, he remembered he had a life-changing decision to make in a few hours. So, he hurriedly took everything from the package and put it in his backpack. And of course he put the credit card in his wallet. He ran outside to his car, but as he was about to close the front door, he realized he almost forgot to say goodbye to his uncle.
See you later, sir.
He yelled. Before he could even hear his uncle's response, he slammed the door and ran to the car. Taking a deep breath, he attempted to process everything. He opened his backpack and dumped the contents onto the passenger seat of his car. There it all lay, his future, to be determined in the next few moments. He couldn't do both, could he? A large part of him hoped he could, but he knew he had to choose one. On one hand, he had the opportunity of a lifetime, a full-ride scholarship to the college of his choosing, something he had worked towards his entire life. On the other hand, a mysterious package that came out of nowhere, filled with more question marks than answers, a location he knew next to nothing about, yet intriguing enough to make him consider following up on it. For all he knew, it could all be a prank. But his friends weren't capable of pranks of this magnitude, were they? He quickly grabbed the passport and credit card and started analyzing them. The problem was that he had never owned either of those two items, so he had no point of reference. How do you know a passport is real? He started typing into his phone. He spent the next 30 minutes in his driveway trying to investigate the authenticity of the passport and the credit card. It was all legit. Well, this entire situation was very suspicious, but everything of importance was up to standard, internet standards at least. He made up his mind, I'm going for it. He put everything back in the backpack, started his car, and drove out of the driveway. He decided to leave his car by his friend's place until he returned. Not knowing how long this trip would take, he thought it would be easier and cheaper not to leave it at the airport. He remembered his uncle's month-long rants about how ridiculously expensive it was leaving the car at Lax a few years ago when they had gone on a family vacation. Before he left his friend's place, he asked him to cover for him in the off chance his uncle would call asking for him. TJ's plan was to tell his uncle that he would be going on a pre-summer training camp with the team, a camp that would be used by the team to confirm the players they actually wanted on the team. When they have a large pool of great players, they use this camp to choose the cream of the crop.
Okay, that sounds good,
he said. Knowing his uncle's perceptive and meticulous nature, he knew his story needed to be airtight. Once he had his story straight and his friend was on board, he opened his ride-sharing app and booked a ride to LAX. Surely enough, within a few minutes the driver pulled up the driveway and TJ was on his way to the airport. Unfortunately, Friday afternoon in LA, headed to the airport, was always going to be a nightmare on the freeway.
We're going to have to take the 105 to the 405. There's no way of avoiding this traffic,
the driver said.
No problem.
TJ replied.
I'm in no hurry.
He knew this would give him more than enough time to process everything that was happening.
Okay, first things first, text Uncle Seymour.
This took a while as TJ had to choose his wording carefully, running through his story over and over in his head, making sure there were no plot holes. When he was done texting his uncle, he put his phone back in his pocket. With his head against the thick, warm car window, TJ stared out at the partially stationary cars on either side of them. As he gazed into the distance, looking at the vast construction on the one side and the exceptionally tall skyscrapers on the other, TJ actually started thinking about the trip.
Nepal. Nepal.
He had no idea where that was. Feeling a slight sense of shame for not knowing, he took out his phone and started looking it up. His search engine showed a host of images of the place. Looks pretty exotic, he mused. Beautiful landscape, and it looks like this place has a lot of mountains. The architecture is nothing like we have here in the US.
Where is this place, though?
He said out loud. As he scrolled further down the page, he realized Nepal was a country in southern Asia neighboring India.
I need to get more info about this place. Good old Wikipedia time.
He said with a chuckle. He skimmed through the basics until he spotted something familiar.
Mount Everest, that's why this place is significant.
He sat there quietly for a few moments. He didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but it was difficult for TJ not to think about the possibility of this trip requiring him to go up the mountain. I mean, who goes to the great Mount Everest and doesn't go up the mountain? But from where this hotel is to the mountain is quite a distance away, so he stopped himself mid-thought and decided not to get ahead of himself, yet continued reading about the area.
We're here.
The driver said.
Wow, that was quick. How long did that take us?
That took us about an hour and 50 minutes.
Really? Man, that felt like a couple minutes.
TJ started to get his things together. He didn't realize how engrossed he had become by all that Nepal reading. It had moved from anxious, concerned reading to a curious fascination.
Thanks, man.
TJ said to the driver.
You're welcome.
The driver said as he drove away. TJ stood in front of the International Departures entrance. As people passed by, entering and exiting through the automated sliding doors, TJ stood by the entrance, without movement. It was almost as though he couldn't see anyone else. He was allowing the moment to sink in. He was also giving himself time to think it all through, one last time.
You gotta commit, TJ, you gotta commit.
He said, trying to both motivate and convince himself to keep going. With the resolve to keep moving forward, he now had to figure out which airline would get him to Nepal. He went to one of the information desks and was directed to one of the airlines offering flights to Nepal.
Hi, I'm in need of assistance. I need to get to Kathmandu, Nepal.
TJ said with a puzzled look on his face and the certainty that he butchered the pronunciation.
Yes, sir. Let me have a look and see if I can assist you with that.
The ticket agent responded, as she laughed ever so softly. TJ felt a little embarrassed at that moment. It didn't help that he had never been outside of the country before, so his self-consciousness was quite high, though he would never let it show. In fact, this was going to be his first time on a plane. Although he had been around the country, his school sports teams always used the bus or the train. And despite the fact that he lived close to LAX and had seen and heard many planes depart and land, he had never been on one.
Did you have a specific arrival and return date, sir?
Yes, I need to be there by 6 p.m. this Sunday, and it will be a one-way flight.
Oh,
The lady said with slight bewilderment.
that might be a little tricky with such short notice, especially with the time zone differences between our two countries. Let's see what we can do, though.
TJ immediately realized the ticket would require some form of payment. All sorts of questions ran through his mind. Was that credit card active? Did it have any money? If so, how much? What happens if you order an airline ticket and don't have the money to pay for it? Is it like a restaurant where they'll make you wash dishes? What's the equivalent of dishwashing at an airport?
We have one flight that matches your exact requirements, sir. It departs at 11:50 p.m.
Great.
TJ replied, masking his anxiety with a smile.
Unfortunately, there's only one seat left, and it's in business class.
The lady pronounced. She wasn't saying it with any sort of judgment. She could sense his travel inexperience and slight reservation in their interaction. He had a single backpack, wearing jeans with a pair of Jordans, a no-name brand jacket with a Lakers snapback. He didn't necessarily shout money. She was more concerned about him being unable to get to his destination than his inability to pay for a business class ticket. In her line of work, she had learned to never judge a book by its cover.
How much will that be?
He asked while taking out his wallet.
$10,251, sir.
She responded.
Here you go.
He said, handing her the credit card, as his smile started to look like it was agonizingly forced.
Before I run that through for you, sir, I need your passport to get all your information.
Oh, come on, really? Just put it through already, he thought to himself. His anxiety levels through the roof.
Of course, here it is.
He said. His agonizingly forced smile had transitioned into an emotionless, straight face. With fixation solely on the card machine, TJ waited as the lady entered all his details. She finally swiped the card. The receipt started printing, and the lady handed the credit card, the passport, and the flight ticket to TJ.
Have a wonderful trip, sir.
Thank you so much.
He replied. He walked away with a great sense of relief knowing it was over. After making his way through security and eventually finding the right terminal, he sat down and waited until it was time to board. It was 9:35 p.m. He wasn't hungry. His last meal was breakfast back at the house, but it had been a remarkably eventful day, one where his mind had been preoccupied by things that were slightly more important than food. So maybe not so surprising. I'll eat on the plane, he thought to himself. As he took out his phone to check the time, it reminded him of one of the other items in the package, the watch. Since opening the package, he had not thought about the watch. He hadn't looked at it, he hadn't put it on, but he simply put it away in the backpack. Now taking out the watch, he started to analyze it. It was entirely black, with black straps and a square face. The face of the watch was just big enough to fit within the margins of his wrist, and it looked like a smartphone when turned off or locked. The watch had no buttons to operate it, no matter which way he turned it. He just couldn't make heads or tails of it. He put the watch back in his backpack, zipped up the backpack, leaned back on his chair, tilted his head back, and closed his eyes. He stayed that way for a few minutes. Opening his eyes, he gazed up at the ceiling. He noticed the detail. It was nothing fancy, not quite what he expected, even though he didn't know what to expect. He saw only two types of lights, both hanging from white, lengthy cables. The first was cylindrical, with an opening at the end where he could see the light bulb. The other had a half-spherical design that covered the entire bulb, which still managed to radiate surprisingly bright light. For every 3 sets of parallel lights, there was a horizontal pillar, which sat at about a 30-degree angle, separating the lights. It was a sort of crimson red, and it sat at about 1 meter in length, stretching all the way to the either side of the building in its width. There were a bunch of white structural poles that made up the rest of the ceiling design. That's pretty bland for such an internationally esteemed airport, he thought. He had no interest in the design of the airport. He was merely trying to kill time, and maybe more importantly, trying not to let his mind run wild thinking about what might potentially await him on the other end of this trip. The PA system was readied for an announcement.
Good evening, passengers. This is the pre-boarding announcement for Flight QR740 to Doha. We are now inviting those passengers with small children and any passengers requiring special assistance to begin boarding at this time. Please have your boarding pass and identification ready. Regular boarding will begin in approximately 15 minutes. Thank you.
As everybody at gate 152 began to shuffle themselves towards the boarding counter, TJ remained seated. A few other passengers stayed in their seats, too. TJ took a moment to people watch. He noticed one guy in particular, wearing a navy blue, pinstripe suit. Something about him caught TJ's attention. He had a phone in his hand, and the only time his eyes weren't on the phone was when he was moving forward. He had a wireless Bluetooth headset in his ear. He appeared to be a businessman of sorts. An LA Times paper, open to the business section, was lying on the guy's carry-on bag beside him. There was something about his demeanor that was a bit off, though. TJ kept watching him. The man was older looking, perhaps in his late 40s or early 50s. TJ could clearly see this man steadily making his way to the front of the line. A little nudge here, a subtle shove there, and the man in the navy blue, pinstriped suit was at the front of the line. Needless to say, his not-so-discreet expedition included knocking down a little kid's candy bar. To top it all off, his interaction with the gentleman checking the boarding passes had no greeting, no thank you, and no acknowledgement there was a person in front of him. Annoyed by the actions of the man in the navy blue, pinstriped suit, TJ rolled his eyes and shook his head as he stood up to start heading to the back of the line.
You saw that too, huh?
The comment came from the girl sitting to his right. He had noticed her earlier. She had apologized to him when her bag hit his leg as she was sitting down.
Saw what?
TJ replied.
The jerk old man in the suit.
She said in a forceful tone.
Don't you just hate it when people who think they are important think they can do what they want when they want? It's so annoying.
Yeah.
For a moment he had forgotten about the actual incident, since he was taken aback by this random girl, passionately going off at a guy who wasn't even there anymore.
Sorry.
She apologized.
It just annoys me sometimes, and I see it so often at airports.
It's cool, I get what you're saying.
He really did. His football achievements had allowed him to encounter schools from all ends of the economic spectrum. The wealthier private schools often had the best teams, since they could afford the best athletes, sports scholarships, and TJ could recall on several occasions where the wealthy parents were treating others, who weren't from the same circles, as though they were less than. Many of the kids would do the same. He had so many negative experiences with spoiled rich kids, that to him they were all the same, young or old.
So, where are you headed?
The girl asked.
Well, the flight is headed to Doha, so
No, man. I mean, where's your final destination?
She giggled as she responded.
my final destination is Nepal, if we make it.
Haha. Final destination reference.
You're the one who used those words.
He said with a slight grin.
Yeah, I must say I did enjoy that franchise though.
So is it the fact that people die in exceptionally gruesome ways that you find appealing, or do you just like death?
Okay, smart guy.
She said as they both laughed.
What about you? Where is your final destination?
I'm headed to India. A friend of mine is getting married.
Wow, that's cool.
While they were talking, TJ noticed that they were almost at the front of the line. He had become quite intrigued by the girl. She had green eyes with a slight hint of blue. The contrast between her eyes and her olive skin was near perfect. Her dark hair matched her dark clothes, and yet, as dark-toned as her clothes were, she was stylish. This he concluded, in his limited knowledge and perspective as a guy who was clueless about fashion. As they got closer to the front, he was trying to figure out how to get her name and possibly her number before it was time for them to board. He knew the probability of them sitting next to one another was highly unlikely.
So, did you notice that they made a mistake on our boarding passes? It's pretty bad,
He said.
Really? I didn't notice. What is it?
Look again, closely. You'll see it.
Taking out her boarding pass, she started looking for the mistake.
Do you see it? Zoe.
He asked with a grin on his face.
No, I can't.
She paused for a moment. Looking up and seeing his grin, she realized what he had done.
You think you're slick, don't you?
She said as she grabbed his boarding pass to see his name.
Tristan. I can't believe I fell for that.
So, can I get your number?
Smiling back at him, she said,
You know that song by Meghan Trainor, the one where she mentions a two-letter word a lot.
Okay,
he said. They both laughed and smiled at each other, while maintaining eye contact.
Next.
They were at the front of the line. She went before him. As she handed over her boarding pass, TJ hoped she would wait for him so they could continue talking. When she was done, she turned around, winked at him, and walked into the plane. As soon as she walked away, he noticed the gentleman at the boarding counter pick up the microphone to make an announcement.
This is the final boarding call for passenger Daniel Smith booked on flight QR740 to Doha. Please proceed to gate 152 immediately. The final checks are being completed, and the captain will order for the doors of the aircraft to close in approximately 5 minutes' time. I repeat, this is the final boarding call for Daniel Smith. Thank you.
The moment he put down the microphone, TJ handed him the boarding pass, then ran to the plane, hoping to catch Zoe before she took her seat. As fate would have it, a young lady was waiting for him, only it was one of the flight attendants.
of course.
TJ said. As the flight attendant showed him to his seat, he kept looking back at every seat he passed, hoping to see her as he walked towards his own seat. He remembered that he was in business class and realized that he probably wouldn't see her again.
This close. I was this close to closing with her.
He said as he took his seat. Slamming his fist against the armrest, he decided to close his eyes and sit in silence for a while. He thought back to the time he had with Zoe in the boarding line. In his haste and frustration, he hadn't taken notice of his surroundings. The soft gentleness of his seat awakened him to the comfort of business class.
So this is what 10 grand looks like.
He said in awe, with a hint of disgust. They were in a Carter Airways Boeing 777-00LR. The seats were 180-degree reclining flatbeds. They had a wood-like finish to them, with some delicately done blue lighting along the sides. The air hostesses even offered pajamas for the long flight. A menu followed the PJs. Looking at the menu, passengers had the option of taking up to a 7-course meal. Of course, TJ took all 7 courses. Once he was done eating, he had the option of watching a movie, listening to music, reading a book, or sleeping. Looking back at the day he had, one that had been both physically and mentally draining, he chose to start the trip with some sleep. Before going to sleep, he quickly checked the on-flight status of the trip to see how long the flight would be. 15 hours and 35 minutes. With that motivation, he fell asleep. The remainder of the flight involved a repetitive cycle of sleep, watching a movie, listening to music, reading, and sleeping. Since these were brief moments of sleep, he didn't have to face the familiar struggle of trying to sleep through an entire restless night. With most of the passengers fast asleep, the lights and PA system suddenly turned on for the captain's announcement.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are now getting ready for our descent into Doha. We are expected to land at 3:45 a.m., local time, 2 hours later than our scheduled time. Once again, we apologize for the unexpected delay before our departure. It is currently 3:30 a.m., local time. It is 32 degrees Celsius in Doha, with the weather expected to be mostly sunny for the rest of the day, with slight winds. We wish you a pleasant stay in Doha, and we hope to see you again soon. On behalf of all our crew, thank you for choosing to fly with us this evening.
TJ sluggishly began to wake up, opening his eyes. Everyone else seemed to be as groggy as he was. The lights were quite sharp, almost piercing through the retina. As they received instructions to ensure their seats and tray tables were in an upright position, TJ gathered all his belongings, making sure he wasn't leaving anything behind. Once the plane landed, the business class passengers were allowed to exit first. TJ had to move quickly, as his connecting flight was already boarding. The air hostesses were standing at the exit, thanking everyone for flying with them and wishing them a wonderful day. As TJ approached the exit, one of the air hostesses stopped him for a brief moment. She handed him a note, then swiftly continued with her farewell routine, as if nothing was amiss. Perplexed by what had just happened, he quickly opened the note to see its contents. 21263430777. Hope to hear from you. Z.
No, she didn't.
TJ said to himself.
Yes.
He exclaimed as he ran to the other side of the airport to reach his boarding gate. He wished he had the time to wait for her, but given the flight delay, he had no choice but to run to catch his connecting flight. He made it before they closed the gate. He felt relief that he managed to avoid the embarrassment of hearing his name called out over the PA system. He was still within the allocated boarding time. As he made his way to find his seat, he was a little less distracted this time. He was able to pay attention to the difference between economy and business class. This plane was smaller than the previous one. Besides the size, all the other features were the same. He didn't spend much time focusing on where he was, though. It was all starting to sink in. His mind was on his destination. He had a few good distractions along the way, but now it was becoming real. Overwhelmed by his thoughts, he tried to give his mind a break. Unfortunately, he couldn't get much sleep on the flight. The only exception was the 20 minutes he did get during the flight's ascent, and that was because of his body's exhaustion from the previous flight. As much as he wanted to sleep during this flight, to give his mind a brief rest, the influx of thoughts denied him that luxury. His brain was in overdrive. Overdrive that was driven by speculation rather than fact and knowledge. He kept thinking about being in a foreign land for the first time. Being in a strange environment. How different will it be? To what extent will I stand out as a non-native? Who will I be able to trust, and how will he know whom to trust? Once again, he asked himself about the legitimacy of this whole thing. He remembered reading up on one site that many locals knew how to speak English. He wasn't sure if it was specifically in Kathmandu or other parts of Nepal. He thought about all the movies he had seen where tourists were taken advantage of by locals, particularly Americans. Food was another stress point. What do they eat in Kathmandu? How will my stomach react to the local cuisine? What if I fall ill while I am in Kathmandu? Medical services. Do I have coverage? What is the quality of the health professionals? These questions would continue until the plane touched the ground.